Is it possible to overcome social anxiety? So if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that I myself suffer from social anxiety. So if you suffer from it, you're not alone. And a question that I often ask myself over the years is it possible to get over it, to overcome it? And you've probably asked yourself this question a million times. In fact, that's probably why you're here. And I want to give a kind of surprising answer to this in that, yes, I absolutely believe it is. In fact, not only do I believe it is, I 100% know it is. And I'm going to share a little story with you. Because in fact, I did overcome my social anxiety several years ago. It came back, and I'll explain that as well, but I did overcome it for a while. So when I first moved here to Poland, I was in a new country. You know, I'm originally from England. I moved here, didn't know anyone. You know, I can speak the language, but it still felt kind of weird because it's my second language, and so I didn't feel very confident in using it. And I just felt really out of place. I just felt really alone, and I felt like I couldn't socialise with anyone. My anxiety that I already had was kind of minor before, but once I came here it was so bad that I basically became housebound. Yep, that's right, for the better part of like a year and a half I basically wasn't able to leave the house. So it was about as bad as you can get. Then with the help of a good friend of mine who actually came all the way over to Poland from England and helped me with this, he got me out of the house. You know, we went out to a few bars and that. We met a few people, and I got to know some people in my area. And because I had a friend that I already knew and trusted with me, it was a bit easier for me to get out and actually meet people. I was still extremely anxious, but you know, it was at least possible, whereas it wasn't before on my own. And so I got out and I was socialising for a couple of weeks regularly, pretty much every night. And after that, because I'd done that, it was easier for me to then go out and repeat that. And after we went back home, I was able to keep going out. I was still very, very anxious, but my anxiety wasn't now so bad that it was stopping me leaving the house. I was able to go out and socialise, and I kept repeating this for weeks and weeks and weeks and months. And over time, I started getting less and less anxious, and I started realising that, hey, my anxiety is slowly disappearing. And it got to the point where my anxiety was just this tiny little thing, you know, just this thought in the back of my mind that, oh, this could go badly. But I was going out every single day. I was socialising every single day. I spent the next couple of years of my life like the most social I've ever been. I was going to parties all the time. I was hanging out with friends every single day, probably for most of the day, probably too much even. But I realised at some point that, hey, my social anxiety had basically been overcome. And I kind of thought that this would just be the way I was for the rest of my life. I thought, great, you know, social anxiety no more. Now, unfortunately, if you are familiar with my backstory a little bit, you will know that I'm also a former addict. During these years, I was also experimenting with drugs, and I had been before. And I basically went off the rails with that, and I found myself with an addiction. And aside from the addiction itself bringing back some of my anxiety, when I eventually got clean, I basically decided I had to cut myself off from everything social for a little while and just cut myself off from the world entirely, just so I could ensure that I'm not, you know, liable to relapse. And so I did that. I cut myself off completely from everyone for like 6 months. The problem with that is that just as my anxiety kind of dissipated with enough social practice, enough lack of social practice did the reverse. My anxiety came back with a vengeance, and I was once again housebound. And I've gradually, over the following years, made it so that I'm no longer housebound. You know, I can go out, I can handle things like phone calls, you know, I can do some social events, but I'm not as social as I was. And that's something I'm working on now. But I share this story with you because I know it can be done, because I did do it before. That's why I'm not all, you know, mopey and down in the gutter because of my social anxiety or anything like that. You know, I would love to be over it again, but I'm confident that I can get over it again, and so I'm not kind of stressing it so much this time around. So if you're struggling with social anxiety, it can be overcome. Now, can it be overcome the way I did it? The way that I did it that time was similar to an exposure therapy method called flooding. I basically was forced right in at the deep end of those situations that made me the most anxious right away, every single day for weeks on end. And because I did that, I had this extreme level of exposure. I basically got over it really, really quickly. And that's very difficult to do, to be able to summon up that courage to throw yourself in at the deep end. And a lot of the times people are just not going to find that feasible. I haven't found that feasible this second time around. So there is another strategy. If you find that you can't force yourself to go out and socialise every single day for weeks on end, then don't worry. It's going to be a bit slower, but there is another approach you can take. That approach is to basically break down your fears into the things that scare you most, you know, things that you think you could never do, things that you think you could probably never do, but maybe, things that you think you're not doing anytime soon, things that you know, find really, really difficult, quite difficult, difficult, not too bad, easy. And you start at this side. You start at the easy, but you know, things that still make you anxious but that are easy. You start there and you keep doing that until it no longer really makes you anxious. Then you move to the next one and the next one, and you slowly work up the hierarchy. If you do this, then just like what happened for me, it will lead to you being able to lead a normal life, not controlled by your anxiety. It's not going to disappear to zero. Everyone has some social anxiety. Everyone has some social situations that make them feel a bit nervous. But you will be able to get it down to a level where it's just in the background, where it's not consuming your life anymore if you work at it. And speaking of working at it, I do want to make more videos on this subject on this channel about exposure therapy, about how we can do it, about how we can get past our anxiety using it. So if you'd like to see those, make sure you subscribe, and also more importantly, make sure you hit the bell icon, because a lot of my videos they'll come out but you won't see them on your front page unless you have notifications enabled. It's just the way the YouTube algorithm works these days, so make sure you do enable notifications. Anyway, thanks for watching, and also a huge thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel and helping allow these videos to happen. If you want to keep watching, check out one of the videos on screen, go watch that, and I'll see you soon. Take care.